expression of spirituality in poetry and music. Anthropomorphism, yes. Uh, so, sir, I would like to ask, what was Hegel's relationship with the church and the idea of God? Because clearly he seems to be saying that Christianity is like at the highest it's the highest form of spirituality and all of that, which is very unconventional because all the critics by far have sort of criticized the church and the idea of God in one way or the other. Not
Which
all, but not all, but many. Not really criticized, but Kant says that God lies in the field of noumena, the one that we don't know. So, but uh, here Hegel clearly states that church is at the high, not the church, but God, the Christian God, is at the highest of all kinds of spirituality. So my question is that how was Hegel looked at from a political and religious angle?
But if you see his views on religion, then they are very ambivalent, right? Like Kant's. On one hand, Kant is trying to elevate reason as a kind of power in its own right. On the other hand, he is also trying to conserve the idea of God, right? Kant, by putting God in noumena. So there is an ambivalence in Kant. Similarly, you find ambivalence or kind of contradictory attitudes. That's what we mean by ambivalence, right? Ambi means two different and balance means values. So you find something similar in Hegel. On one hand, he says that Christianity is the highest form of religious expression. He puts religion above arts, right, in the hierarchy of arts, but philosophy are above religion, right? If you remember. And then he would also talk about how if there is a failure in the dialectic of master-servant kind of uh, conflictual dynamics, then it results in unhappy consciousness. And Christianity is also one of the expressions of unhappy consciousness, like even, what should I say, even Stoicism is also considered as an expression of unhappy consciousness. So you can see that there is an ambivalence about religion that you find in both the Enlightenment thinkers. So it's not a clear-cut relation. It's contradictory and ambivalent.
Got it, sir. I get it.
Yeah. So there is no clear-cut atheistic position that is taken. And probably one of the most important atheistic position and is anti-Christian position taken by Shelley in his small booklet called Necessity of Atheism, and in which he argues that though there is some power, higher creative power, the idea of organized religion and church, I'm sorry, is something that is not required. And he rejects the idea of any Christian or Islamic or any kind of God, and considers creator as the divine being. So for which he got rusticated from his university. But that is more atheistic position that you find being taken on romantics, right? Like Shelley. But these people are ambivalent. Even people like Newton would not be atheistic. Even Darwin was not atheistic, right? So atheism is a very interesting development. We need to look into the history of atheism in the West. Maybe Christopher Marlowe was an atheist. Okay. So now let's turn over and go into another very important literary critic for us as students of English literature, and that is Coleridge, right? And Coleridge was deeply influenced by Kant, which is the reason why we took a detour to German idealism via Kant and Hegel, right? And as we have been discussing, we are looking at English literary criticism, but then on a broader European context of English literary criticism, right? So we look at the classical heritage, we look at relation between Christianity and various kinds of conflicts within Christianity, which are pan-European. We are also looking at relation between France and England, right? And French Revolution being another very important influence on English literature, or I should say world history, right? French Revolution in some way became a kind of definition of modern politics. That either you are on the side of French politics of revolution, or you are on the politics of people who oppose revolution, right? So the ideology is split into for and against French Revolution. So people who support French Revolution, the liberals, the revolutionaries, the radicals, right, which would become something called the left. And people who would oppose the idea of revolution would be something called right. People who would be supporting aristocracy and monarchy and conservatism. So French Revolution is a global event almost. And a person who was deeply influenced by French Revolution was William Wordsworth and his friend St. Coleridge, who went with him to France. And he wrote a poem on Bastille, and the conquest of, or the destruction of Bastille became, I think, title of one of his poems. But Coleridge is probably one of the most important critics in the tradition of English literature, right? So if Dryden is called, into inverted commas, father of English criticism, Coleridge would be called one of the most important and influential literary critics in English literature, right? You are familiar with his poems? Have you read any of his poems by Coleridge?
We had Kubla Khan.
Which one?
Kubla Khan.
Kubla Khan. And it is a kind of a fragment, right? Right. And which one? Kubla Khan and?
The Rime of the
Time of the Ancient Traveler. And if you look at them, they are in balladic form, right? I don't remember about Kubla Khan, but the Rime of Ancient Mariner uses ballad as a meter. Are you aware of that? The Rime of
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So ballad meter is a folk meter, right? And folk meter means the meter which belongs to more or less non-literate or less literate sections of the society who hand out traditional forms from one generation, pass one form from generation to generation, and the kind of cultural forms that don't have a kind of authorship. Such kind of forms are called folk, right? And in German philosophy and in German nationalism, you find folk, which is written as VOLK, right? Folk. And that becomes a marker of authentic German identity, especially with Grimm brothers, who in the same period as the period that we are discussing, would collect a lot of folk tales from people and publish them as folk tales and fairy tales. So have you heard of Grimm brothers?
Yes, sir.
right? Most of the famous folk tales, fairy tales are from the first collection by German scholars named Grimm brothers, right? And for them, this folk literature was the marker of authentic German identity. So you can see how it is connected to politics of nationalism. So folk as marker of authentic German culture and cultural nationalism, right? As against the written and printed, which was seen as mechanical and a kind of contamination of the purity of the true and authentic German culture. So something similar is happening here while Wordsworth and Coleridge are rejecting the neoclassical forms like the heroic couplet, which people like Pope and Dryden and Johnson would be using, right? The heroic couplet form, you're aware of that? In Pope, we saw an essay on man and essay on criticism written in heroic couplet.
Yes.
So rejection of heroic couplet in favor of folk, right? Rejection of neoclassical urban themes in favor of rustic and natural. Rejection of neoclassical poetics of mimesis in favor of poetics of expression. All these are the shifts that constitute the romantic movement or romanticism in literature, right? So these are key shifts that are happening. It's almost a revolution. So Coleridge was also one of the earliest theorists of romantic view of literature, and he wrote extensively. And some of his most famous poems are, apart from rhyme, are The Frost at Midnight, Christabel. Are you reading Christabel? Kubla Khan in lyrical ballads, right? He also wrote on educational, social, political, religious matters in his book like Lectures on Politics and Religion and on the constitution of church and state. But his most important criticism is collected in his book called Biographia Literaria, which is one of the most important books of literary criticism. In which he writes about Shakespeare and Milton and the English tradition. But his views of these poets are shaped by his romantic outlook to literature and life. He went to France with Wordsworth, and then he was closely associated with Wordsworth. Both of them went to a place called Lake District. You might have heard of all this, right? And he had some crazy ideas with his friend called Robert Southey or Southey. I don't know how to pronounce it, but he wanted to form a society of equals, something called pantisocracy in Pennsylvania in America, but that plan fell apart very quickly. He was addicted to opium, as you know from his Kubla Khan. What is interesting is how he becomes one of the revolutionary. His ideas were deeply in favor of revolutionary ideology of French Revolution and was disillusioned, very much like Wordsworth, and became extremely conservative towards the end of French Revolution, as you know, started from 1789 to 1799. Right, so by the time the collection of poems appear as Biographia Literaria, or the book of criticism appears named as Biographia Literaria in 1817, right? French Revolution has completely turned into something else and is taken over by Napoleon. So he becomes extremely conservative and admirer of Edmund Burke, one of the English conservative thinkers. So you can see the kind of trajectory, ideological trajectory of Coleridge and how it is connected to French Revolution. So one of his early poems is Ode on the Destruction of Bastille, right? Page number 440, where he praises French Revolution. He says, I see, glad liberty succeed, with every patriot virtue in her train, and mark yon peasant's raptured eyes. Secure he views his harvest rise, and so on and so forth. And he was a dropout from Cambridge University, and he also lectured along with his like-minded revolutionary friends like William Friend, उसका surname ही Friend है, John Thival, who was a kind of Jacobin in his sympathies. By Jacobin, we mean a group of people in French Revolution, a club, right, who were the leaders of the French Revolution, like Robespierre. And his speeches are described. Coleridge gave a lot of talks, which Thival would describe on 441, first paragraph, as leveling sedition and constructive treason, which is the phrase that Thival used to describe Coleridge's earlier phase of revolutionary ideology. And by the time France started conquering other countries like Switzerland, yes, the Jacobians were people like Robespierre, a group of radical revolutionaries in Paris who supported, who led the French Revolution. Right? But they were also later on turned into a kind of paranoid politicians who would guillotine anybody who they would label as supporter of opponent of revolution, and that became known as the Reign of Terror. Right, that was the last phase of French Revolution. He wrote poems like Recantation and France and Ode. Now, France and Ode is a poem in which he describes how his political views and his views on France changed. And interestingly, like Wordsworth, you see that the idea of liberty and freedom and revolution was slowly transformed from a political idea into a kind of spiritual idea which is found in nature, right? And nature starts becoming an embodiment of liberty and divinity and all that. So there is a kind of transfer of the idea of liberty from the political to the domain of nature. That is very similar to Wordsworth, right? On page number 442, if you are having the book in front of you, he becomes a sharp critic of Enlightenment rationalism as was embodied in revolutionary ideals of French Revolution, right? Especially the idea of reason as something that produces modern democratic state, right? So Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau would look at rationality and reason as something that produces a new kind of quality, something like the democratic state. Now, Coleridge is bitterly critical of this, and he says that this mechanical application of reason, kind of artificial forcing of rationality on history, would result in all sorts of abortive attempts. So his criticism of French Revolution He is very similar to Edmund Burke's. That and he also becomes very critical of Enlightenment philosophies like those of Locke, Hume, and others. And on page 442, we learn that he saw that the second paragraph, last line, he saw the revolution as defying human reason. Deifying, that is to put on pedestal and consider it as divine. And arrogantly misapplying this reason in the presumption that states and governments ought to be constructed as machines. So this application of rationality to politics, which is at the heart of French Revolution, in Coleridge's view, is extremely artificial, which views the state as if it's machine. Yeah, bolo Shatabdi.
Sir, can you repeat the line again? I couldn't follow
It is
it.
there on page 42. I am not saying on my own. On page 442 of Habib, on second paragraph, last lines, where
Okay, sir.
applying human reason to state and government was seen as an act of creating a kind of mechanical idea of state, as if the state and the government are machines that are produced through science and technology. Right, and that is his complaint against the ideals of French Revolution. So what you see in this is that it is also critical of liberal idealisms that influence French Revolution, but it also seems to be critical of idea that rationality and the machine, right, seems to be the problem with rationality, that it's a mechanical activity. And it makes human life and the world more mechanical. The idea of reason, right, that is embodied in French Revolution is something. And if you remember, we also talked about how Romanticism is a response, a reaction against industrialization, right? So Coleridge and other thinkers of the period associated rationality of French Revolution with Industrial Revolution. Something that, so as if government and the states are like factories that can be produced through reasoning. They are as if machines working for, as if state is a gadget that you have made for yourself. People have made for themselves for their own benefit. So this idea is something that he is critical of. So what he does is he turns towards his pet philosopher, Immanuel Kant, and gives it a Kantian philosophy, a strange kind of theological, mystical spin, right? Christian spin, a kind of interpretation of almost religious interpretation of Kant. Something that even his American friend named Emerson would do, as we will discuss soon. Right? So he is now taking Kant and making him into a kind of religious philosopher that Kant was not. What he does is he sees Kantian idea of transcendental reason as if it's a universal idea. It's a reason of God. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. That the Kantian idea of transcendental reason is seen as a kind of religious power. And let us go to the notes that we are viewing so that you remember. Can you see the screen?
Yes, sir.
And what do you see? Do you see transcendental idealism of Kant?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you can see that this faculty of reason, which is transcendental, right, is made into a kind of religious power by Coleridge. He sees this reason as a kind of universal reason. And against reason, there is something like understanding, right? Understanding is what Coleridge interprets as enlightenment reason, right? For Coleridge, understanding is what is meant by the reason in enlightenment sense of the word. For him, this is partial, this is mechanical, this is what produces science and technology. This is what is uh, at the heart of reasoning as we understand it. But this is the divine power of reason. Which is something which Kant did not imply, right? So you can see how Coleridge is using Kant for his own purposes, right? He is saying that this power is the divine power, while this understanding, which has concepts, is something that is at heart of scientific rationality. Right. So, which is not exactly what Kant said. Kant was actually trying to explain scientific rationality in terms of transcendental idealism. I hope you remember. He is trying to explain how laws like E is equal to mc square or F is equal to ma are possible, right? Which are products of human mind, but still nature obeys those laws. How is that possible? Is because both nature and human mind have a common ground, that is the transcendental faculty of reason. I hope you remember that. But Coleridge makes it into something else. For him, that power is divine power, and this is scientific power. Right? And imagination is also bifurcated. This imagination, right, which connects understanding with sensibility, right, is what he would call primary imagination. Right. So imagination is also given a kind of theological spin. We'll see how. That is on page 446. For Coleridge, this imagination is what makes understanding a living power. This imagination makes understanding into a living power, right? That gives its intuitive force. So on page 446, this is one of the most cited famous paragraphs from Biographia Literaria. And he makes a distinction between imagination, which is primary and secondary. The primary imagination, he says, I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a reputation in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in infinite I am. The secondary, which I consider as echo of the former, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with the primary in its kind of its agency and differing only in degree and its mode of operation. The secondary imagination, according to Coleridge, is that which produces art, right? Something which Kant has called as productive imagination. The first kind of imagination that we saw was regarding comprehension, was regarding understanding. So the first kind of imagination is not only something that makes understanding possible, but for Coleridge, it is also a reputation in the finite mind, that is the limited human mind that all of us have, of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. And this is where he brings in a whole theological, Christian, metaphysical spin on Kant, right? So primary imagination is the imagination which makes us understand that this is a pen, right? But this is a pen we understand because of the power of imagination. And this power of imagination is a kind of echo of the greater power, right, of God, almost, right? That's what he means, the eternal and his act of creation in the infinite I am. And that is a biblical idea, that how does, uh, what is logos of God? The word of God is that I am, right? It does not have I am something, I am that, I am this. It's just I am. It is the statement of being of God, right? So the infinite being of God, in that infinite being, there is this eternal act of creation. So God said, let there be light, and there was light. God said, let there be world, and there was world that was created in 7 days. So this is the primary productive power of God, which finds its echo in our limited mind, finite mind, right? And this is this imagination that you find in Kant, the primary imagination. The secondary imagination is something similar to primary, but it differs only in degree, right? And it is identical with the primary. In its kind of agency, that is how it works. So this secondary imagination, it differs only in what? Degree, यानी कितने हद तक वो काम कर सकता है, and in the mode of operation. Otherwise, it's similar to the primary imagination. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. And where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and to unify. It is primarily, it dissolves all the sensory data and creates another parallel world which appears unified. It is essentially vital, that is, it is essentially living power. Even as all objects, as objects are essentially fixed and dead. So this secondary imagination, right, is a power, right, which differs from primary only in its degree and only in its mode of operation. It operates in a different way, right? And that is at the heart of maybe separation of science and arts, because science is the power of imagination in order to understand, going back to our good old Kantian frame here, right? This understanding, which for Coleridge is scientific understanding, is also facilitated by the power of imagination. But power of art, that is secondary imagination, is more of a synthetic kind. It unifies, it dissolves, diffuses, dissipates, and creates a new unified world, right? And that is the power of producing fictions and fictional narratives. Yeah. Pooja, what is primary imagination? Primary imagination is basically Kantian imagination, which enables us to understand that this is a pen, right? But Coleridge sees this primary imagination as an echo of the imagination or creative power of God, right? Which created eternal creation in infinite being, I am. तो उसका echo है, as if it's a kind of microcosm of the macrocosm, the cosmic power, right? So it's a kind, so you can see how he is putting metaphysical, theological spin on Kant, right? So the primary imagination is that power through which we understand the world around us. But we are able to understand this world because this power, which is an echo of infinite creativity of God. Secondary imagination is a power similar to this, but it differs in its degree and its mode. Why? Because this diffuses, dissolves, and dissipates and fuses in order to recreate. Let me give you an example, right? For example, the world of Harry Potter, right, is made from multiple sources. Right? It has taken things from folk and Christianity and lot of Norse tales and folk tales about magic and so on and so forth, right? In order to create a world which is a unified whole on its own. So that is what act of imagination does, the secondary imagination. So is that clear distinction between secondary and primary imagination? Pooja?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Jay is asking, is this related to Plato's theory? How? Can you say something more, Jay?
Plato is also talking about imitation, right? That what is there in the world is imitation of the real.
Hmm.
And he is also talking about the we don't have the capacity of imagination, and what in his primary category he talks about the importance of God in our imagination, or importance of the that power in our imagination.
Who does that?
We are talking about the primary, right?
Right, but how is it connected to Plato?
So Plato also talks about the imitation, right? So he tells that what is the bad is not real. The bad is different in the reality. What we see is the imitation of the real. So he is also talking about that. He also telling that we cannot do anything. What we are imagining is the outcome of the divine.
No, Plato is not saying that. Plato is not saying that the bed that you see in front of you is created by a power that is similar to God's power. ये तो सिर्फ कॉलरेज ही कह रहा है.
Okay.
It would be closer to Neoplatonism, rather than Plato. For Plato, this bed is transient, imperfect derivative, which will be destroyed one day, right? And so it's the inferior form of being compared to the idea of bed in your mind, right? So please don't confuse uh, imitation with imagination, because they are almost opposite. Imagination is a productive power. It is power of expression. It has something to do with expressive theory of art. Imitation is more like reflexive theory of art, reflection, right? So
Yes, sir.
it's classical, neoclassical theory. But Neoplatonism is something that you will find that it seems to be, has some parallels with Coleridge's thought, right? Not Plato, but Plotinus.
Yeah, he has made three worlds, Plotinus.
So Plotinus sees this art as emanation, right, of a higher power. So though it is imperfect, it is not something bad,
Yeah.
right? In fact, it's one of the gateways, or it is one of the staircase to the more perfect, higher world of the one. But
Understood.
still, you have to understand the difference between these theories, not to confuse one for another. Though you may find some similarities, and this is for all of you, that there are similarities between what Plotinus has said and Coleridge, but not to confuse one for other. And that is precisely the reason why we are studying history of criticism and not criticism. What does he mean by coexisting with conscious will? Which line?
The paragraph that you were reading, the secondary I consider as an echo of the former, coexisting in the conscious world.
Yeah. It's conscious, means you can consciously create a new fictional world like that of Harry Potter through power of imagination. That is what it means, right? And that power is a echo of the primary power. And primary power itself is an echo of the creative power of God, right? Of eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Right? So it's an echo of an echo. And that is what I think led Jay to think that this is imitation of imitation. Right, Jay?
Yes, sir.
It is not imitation, it is echo. And we are talking of powers. We are not talking of artworks. Right? Plato is saying that when painter paints a bed, he is making imitation of imitation. Right? This is about powers and their relation. So first power is the power of God. The second power is something that is given to all human beings, which is an echo of the power of God, primary imagination. And secondary imagination is a power of, which is an echo of the primary power. But that is coexisting with conscious will, it creates something, right? It's a creative power. And the power to dissolve, diffuse, and dissipate in order to create a kind of organic whole, right, is what he will later call something as SM-plastic imagination. Right? It has SM-plastic imagination. Page number 448. Last 4 lines, right? Imagination is SM-plastic. What do you mean by SM-plastic? Means to shape into one. जैसे प्लास्टिक आर्ट्स में आप अलग अलग चीजें लेके शेप करते हो वैसे. So this is the SM plastic power of imagination. It takes various things, but it gives it an organic unity. And by organic unity, you mean that different things are connected to the whole, and it becomes integral to that whole, like flower, a tree, root, branches, trunk. These are various parts of a same whole, that is tree, right? Kidneys, brains, intestines, lungs are all separate, but they are part of one thing called human body. So this is what is meant by organic unity, to take different parts and make them integral to one greater whole. And that power is called SM plastic power, power to create organic wholes, WHOLE. Right, and that is what imagination does. Yeah, Pooja, you had a question? That is in contrast to something called fancy. Let's go back to 446. Secondary imagination is in contrast to fancy. Now, fancy is also something very interesting. He says fancy, on the contrary, has no counters to play with. but fixes fixities and definities. The fancy is indeed no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space and blended with and modified by that empirical phenomenon of the will, which we express by the word choice. But equally with the ordinary memory, it must receive all its material ready-made from the laws of association. So it is something like daydream. It is something like fantasy, right? So fancy produces those uh, images which are not made into a larger whole, right? Those are kind of snatches of your memory. कुछ बचपन में हुआ, you make it into a story around it, right? It is memory that is dislocated from, or to use his word, emancipated from order of space and time, right? And it is for him mechanical. It is partial. It is about fragmentariness. So fancy produces fragmented images, while imagination is assemblastic. It produces unified organic wholes and totalities. That's the key difference between fancy and imagination. Fancy, because it works with choice, it's mechanical. Everybody can fancy, right? But you need to develop your secondary imagination if you are an artist. Create complete worlds. Any questions? So you can see how it takes the centrality given by uh, Kant to imagination, gives it a kind of Christian theological spin, right? And in almost assimilates or appropriates Kant into the metaphysical theological system of his own Christianity. Yeah, Shatabdi, fancy is something that produces fragmentary images, right? It's mechanical. It does not diffuse, dissipate, dissolve in order to create a new world, right? Imagination is vital, while fancy is mechanical, right? Just like your fantasies, your daydreams, which you make a note in your diaries, right? It's not the same as the worlds created by the writers, right? The worlds that are created by the writers are kind of new worlds made from various memories and whatnot. It's a cocktail of many things, right? But it has a kind of organic unity. That is what imagination does. Imaginations are of two types, primary and secondary. Fancy is all about fixities and definities. उसमें dissolve नहीं होता एक चीज दूसरे में. जैसे biblical theme of good versus evil and sun and Trinity, all those things may become important to Harry Potter narrative. But then you also have pagan folk tales, Celtic folk tales, or if you've seen Lord of Rings, then all these are fictional worlds which take many other narratives and they are dissolved in order to create another new narrative. This dissolution does not happen in fancy. Its fragmentary nature stays. It's like a mosaic, but it can never become a kind of complete painting. Is that clear, Shatabdi?
Yes, sir.
And as Habib points out, this theory of imagination is also taken from Schelling and a psychologist named Johann Nicolaus Tetins on page 447, last paragraph. And the whole classical and medieval tradition of fantasia, something that we have heard of in Longinus. And you can see, I think we are coming closer to Neoplatonicism and Longinus with this. Longinus, if you remember, says there are many kinds of sources of sublime. Do you remember that? Like rhetoric, language, great grand theme, great emotions. All these things have to come together as an organic whole, unity, in order to produce the effect of the sublime. So the idea of organic unity you find in Longinus as well. Right? What he does is, if you look at page 447, that the long tradition of thinking about fantasia was seen as a more creative power as compared to imagination, Latin imaginatio. But Greek thinkers cited above, like Kant and Schelling, they overturned it, right, this hierarchy, and gave more important role to imagination instead of just seeing as merely perceptual one, viewing it as a creative and unifying force. So in Coleridge, fancy is more mechanical mode of creativity. It receives materials ready-made from the law of associations, merely. And this Coleridge theory of imagination is one of the most important topics in romantic criticism.
Sir,
Anything?
I have
Yeah.
sir, but Kant's imagination also operates on the various data received through the senses, and here fancy is also fancy. Coleridge claims that fancy is more mechanical. So, isn't he going a bit against Kant over here?
Yeah,
Because
he
if
is.
fancy,
See, Kant does not make this clear-cut distinction between primary and secondary and fancy. These three things are totally Coleridge's inventions. But as you can see on page 47, 447, he says they are taken from people like Johann Nicholas Tetens, right? Three levels of imagination. So he's taking Kant but putting and making his own system out of various sources, right? That's what Coleridge is doing. So
yes,
if fancy is not like primary imagination or imagination in Kant, it's more like memory and fantasy, right? It's fragmented rather than creating a coherent world. So just you might have noticed that everybody can fantasize, all of you daydream, right? But you cannot write novels with and create those worlds which require greater secondary imagination. Fancy सबकी होती है. Secondary imagination has to be, it's a speciality of creative writers. And what seems to be happening here, that this power seems to be a kind of uh, has a theological angle to it, as if writers are like demigods. So just like writers, just like God made the universe from his word, with capital word, right? Logos. In same way, writers produce new worlds out of their words, right? And that is secondary imagination. और किसी का कुछ कहना है? Apart from his opium addiction. Any doubts? No doubts? No questions?
No, sir. It seems it's too early for questions still.
Okay. So what we'll do is we'll meet today is at 2:45, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And continue our discussion, right? And from now onwards, we have to speed up our discussions because we have a train to catch. Right? So we are going to speed up our discussion. Okay, so let's meet at 2:45.